So at kind of the top of the funnel, you have the application layer. It's like Socket or Cluster, Agoric, basically things that are more developer facing. And then you have underneath that, you have the account layer, things like Particle Network, Orb Labs, Arcana, also chain signatures have some overlap in this layer. Underneath that, you have a somewhat more debated upon layer, which is something that you can call the blockchain layer.
Nothing we say here is investment advice, legal advice, life advice, or representative of the views of the organization we are part of or affiliated with. See chainabstracted.com for more information.
This is Chain Abstracted, obviously. It's a near podcast. Michael and I do this, every week or so at this point. Today we're scheduled to do 3, but we're not going to be able to do the third one because we have other shit to do. But that's also a Nuffle one, so it's like I can't do this anymore in 3 hours. But nice to have you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, the fact you guys are doing even just 2 in a day is insane. But I'm glad that we had a chance to get something together. I was actually, yesterday I was watching the podcast with I think it was who was it from Agoric that you guys had on? Agoric and the Cosmos ecosystem. I think it was his name on Twitter, Zaki or something like that. I'm correct. Yeah, that was I think one of the earlier episodes, but I was watching that one, and that one was pretty good. So I'm excited to get into it today. I think there's some pretty good questions that you sent me.
Likewise, yeah. It was a funny one there because it's he has a different perspective on the world coming from Cosmos. So I mean, but yeah, that's cool. But love to learn more about you. I guess like how did you start getting interested in crypto and then working in crypto?
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. I first got into crypto and started kind of, I guess just playing around with the space when I was 15. And so that's when I kind of, start trading and stuff like that. I think it was actually the emergence and the pump of Dogecoin, maybe 3 years ago or something like that, 4 years ago, that really like caught my attention. And I was like, well, this is a great opportunity to make a lot of money. So I wanted to mine Dogecoin, which ended up being not a very good opportunity, but it got me into the space, and I got really into the Dogecoin community when I was, I didn't really have anything else to do. I was doing remote school at the time because that was right after the pandemic. And so I kind of got into the space and talked a lot in the Discord communities and, just kind of had a good time learning about what crypto was and like the trading aspect of it and stuff like that. And eventually I decided to get into the more developer oriented side of Web3. So I started building some of my own initial applications. I had actually known some very rudimentary Python. And so I kind of went back and learned all the foundational programming languages again, all out of the kind of goal of building something on chain. And then when I was 16, I did that. I built an application called Amity DeFi, which I got lucky actually ended up being, like, at least for me as a, being 16, a somewhat successful application. I think it ended up with 3,000 or 4,000 users. Essentially, it was basically bringing the ability to do on-chain transactions on Discord. So you could be on Discord, you could have a wallet. It was a custodial wallet, but you could do transactions, you could send other people, you could swap and airdrop and stuff like that. And so it was a lot of fun. It basically kind of added like a layer of interaction in communities. I think that type of interaction is more commonplace today, especially with things like Telegram bots, where there's a million products that do this. But back then it was somewhat of a new concept. And I spent a long time putting that together. And the first implementations of it were pretty terrible, but it got better over time as I learned how to code better and stuff like that. And eventually it was probably, 3 or 4 months after I turned 16. As soon as I turned 16, I had to get a job. And this was an agreement that I had with my parents if I wanted to keep doing remote school. And so I had to get a job, and the job that I chose was an in-person job, changing tires at a discount tire that was 5 minutes away from me. And so I did that for 2 or 3 days a week, and I was pretty miserable. I hated it. I'm not a very athletic person, so I kind of knocked me out every single time. And yeah, you're just like repairing just like holes of tires, stuff like that. And but I had to do it, otherwise I didn't want to go back to in-person school because I didn't like that either. And so I realized eventually, I was like, oh wait, I'm spending most of my time outside of work building stuff in Web3. So why not I just apply to a bunch of Web3 jobs? I had no experience at that time, but I applied to, 100, 200 jobs or something like that. Literally everything I could find on LinkedIn that I was not qualified for. And eventually I got a very entry-level developer relations position at an RPC provider, and ended up being there for about 1.5 years. I eventually went on to lead their developer relations team for quite a while. I think for about 7 or 8 months before I joined Particle back in September or August. So I've been at Particle for about a year.
You're 18. Well, how old are you then?
I'm 18. Yeah, I'll be 19 in a few months.
Damn, son. I didn't even think that's new info to me. Well, that's great, man.
I love it. Like, props to you, Ethan, and I think it's really impressive how well you've been able to climb into this space. My first question was literally going to be, have you ever worked a job that's not crypto? So I guess your parents ruined the purity of saying, no, you've only been pure crypto, but that's a really cool origin story.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think if I had worked at like a grocery store or something that I was probably more comfortable with, that I didn't mind being at, I probably would have not applied for a job in crypto because I would have just been like, whatever, I mean, I don't mind doing this. But it was because I hated changing tires so much that I decided to give crypto a shot and apply for jobs because I was so desperate to get out of that job. And so, I mean, for some capacity, it was a good thing, but hopefully, I don't know, maybe Ethereum and Bitcoin crashes and I end up there again. But I think I think it's been pretty good so far. But yeah, I think it's I'm right now I'm at around 3 years full time in developer relations. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun so far.
That's funny. That's great, man. Well, I appreciate your everything. So let's get into Particle Network then. But how did that happen? I guess, like, how did you start working there? What was did you just get hired as a DevRel, or I know that, like, when Particle Network comes to mind, I just think about you. So like that's kind of the, like, how did you grab that role?
Yeah, I when I was working at the RPC provider that I was at is called Chain-Stack. When I was working there, I was there. At that point, whenever I originally decided to move to Particle, I had been there for I think a year and a half, and I didn't really want to move organizations, but I basically flew out to San Francisco and I met with my CEO, and I kind of was interested in the pitch of Particle because I'd heard about Particle a little bit before, and at some events I'd heard about them, and so I was like, okay, well, I'll consider it. And back then, even like, the pitch was pretty similar to what it is today, which is really the origin of like solving fundamental UX problems, and making it easier for people to get into Web3 and eventually use Web3. So starting with like the onboarding with social logins and stuff like that has really been Particle's history for a long time, is getting people in through their Google account and Twitter account and stuff like that. And then evolving towards, chain abstraction and account abstraction, which is that deeper UX optimizations, being able to have a single balance across all chains, and, within just like the deeper account abstraction side of things, all the great benefits that come with that. And so that really interested me because I had been like a little bit attached to account abstraction. I had been doing some research into it and playing around with it, and I was very kind of captured by that type of that part of the industry, the more kind of like UX part of the industry. And so I decided to to kind of pull the trigger on that and to move over to Particle specifically to build towards that goal of improved user experience. And so, I mean, like, Particle's been around, I think, for around 3 to 4 years at this point. During its entire lifespan, it kind of started out as purely social logins, and that was kind of where it sat for a long time. So just acting as infrastructure that gets you in through Google and Twitter and email and phone number or whatever else it may be. And then starting basically, in the last year to 2 years, Particle kind of moved towards implementing account abstraction and working really closely within the ERC 427 part of the ecosystem. So working with Biconomy, doing a lot of its own account abstraction infrastructure and stuff like that. And so that actually is where we probably found most of our recent success, was in account abstraction, specifically in kind of this flow where you have social logins that lead to smart accounts. That proved to be a pretty big deal for a lot of people because you solve a lot of problems with that, right? You solve the onboarding problem, and you solve the problem of, for example, gasless transactions and needing to hold specific gas tokens and, a million other things. And so that's kind of where Particle ended up for quite a while. And then basically starting in November of last year, that's where we started really pushing on chain abstraction as sort of like the next step and the next evolution of account abstraction in our work in the onboarding part of the space. So because like what you can kind of, when you look at user experience, I think typically what I say is that, like, user experience, it's very easy to create a great UX in the confines of a given application, of a single application. Like, UX in Web3 isn't really as broken as sometimes people will say it is, because if you look at a single application, if you totally ignore interoperability and like cross-application usage, a single application, you can create pretty much, like, you can almost make Web3 invisible, right? Onboard through social login, use account abstraction to remove gas fees and remove pop-ups and stuff like that. A lot of other kind of like abstractions at the application level that can essentially give you the ability to use these applications, and in a lot of cases, they can make it feel very almost indistinguishable from Web 2. And the infrastructure is already there. It's proven. It works quite well. There are, of course, like, rough edges to it, but within applications, it's great. But the larger issue in the space, and there's a lot of things attached to this that maybe we can get into later, the larger issue in this space is the fact that at an ecosystem level, UX is still terrible. And it's like, if I want to go to an application on chain A and then I want to go to another application on chain B, I mean, as you guys know very well, this experience is miserable for end users. And so this is where, this is why really we decided to start building chain abstraction infrastructure on top of our existing stack, because we felt like if you can solve that onboarding problem and you can provide that foundational UX technology for the applications, and you can solve and at least or contribute to solving the problem of the ecosystem level UX, then that's where you start to have some pretty massive change in terms of the types of applications that can be built, the type of actual consumer adoptions you can see in the industry, and eventually just kind of like Web3 seeing its PMF, in the broader kind of context of the internet. And so that's a little bit more about kind of our context and how we've ended up where we're at.
I see. So how is Particle Network constructed today? Is it, I know you guys are building it L1, right? How does the construction look like? And the other question is, maybe this is something like critical of the space, but we're talking about, like, if Near does the same thing, right? It's an L1 that is like trying to do chain abstraction, but it's a chain itself, right? So how does that work? Like, how do we, like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that, like, we actually wrote. We recently published a whole page on our website that's like, the page is literally titled "Why Does Particle Network Need an L1?" Which is like trying to justify, like why is it even an architectural component? And basically, like, the way that the architecture works is that really the core product here is not the L1. The L1 is essentially a coordination layer, and it's I'll get into like the specifics in a second, but it's at the very standard level, it's a way that you can coordinate and sort of create consistency with smart accounts across different chains. But really, the core product is a universal account. So universal account is something that we, if you go through our Twitter or you go through my Twitter, you'll kind of see as a common term, because this is essentially, it's sort of like a at a foundation, it uses account abstraction to essentially give a user a single balance they can use across all chains. And so this is like the most basic way of understanding it. Universal accounts are essentially just smart accounts that users can use uniformly across every application, across every chain, without needing to bridge. So they have a single consolidated balance everywhere. And so how does it actually work? Well, we have an L1 that drives a lot of this functionality. The users in their accounts, they still live on these external chains. They still live on Base and Polygon and Ethereum and whatever else it may be. But the actual underlying coordination for the cross-chain transactions that these universal accounts execute, as well as the state of the accounts themselves, is managed by the L1. So, like, there's kind of like two main problems that having a chain itself is solving, especially with this type of architecture. The first thing that you guys might be familiar with is within account abstraction, specifically ERC-437 within the Ethereum ecosystem, there's a pretty big problem with cross-chain, or just like multi-chain in general, because if I deploy a contract on one chain and then I deploy it on 3 other chains and I change the state, or I do some arbitrary state change on chain A, let's say I add a module, right? Or I change the signer or something like that. And all of a sudden, the state on chain A is now different from what I have on B, C, and D, right? So now my smart account is it's totally different than the other 3 instances on these different EVM chains. And this is a problem because it means that there's no consistency across chains, especially whenever you're making updates to this arbitrary state. And so the solution to this is kind of this idea of a key store hub. And this has been talked about a lot. Vitalik has talked about this. Safe is doing some good work on this. And so we're basically implementing a key store hub through the means of our blockchain, which is essentially a way of having a single kind of source of truth and shared state that is universal across all deployments of the account. And so if I deploy the account on 5 different EVM chains, I change the signer on one chain, we can actually, using the kind of key store hub on our chain, we can identify that and reflect the changes on every other chain that is deployed on. And so the state for the smart account is always consistent. And so you fix the multi-chain problem with smart accounts. And this is a pretty huge issue, even though it might not seem like, like it's kind of a small thing in the grand scope. But this is like to use AA across chains, this needs to be solved. The other thing is basically being able to coordinate transactions with solvers that are atomic. And so the way that we bridge funds across chains is something that you guys also might be familiar with. It's a very across style solver-based bridging mechanism where we essentially have a transaction that the user wants to do. We front them funds for that transaction. The solver fronts the funds for that transaction. They pay for the transaction, and they pay themselves back using the funds in the origin chains. And so if I want to buy an NFT on Base that costs $100, and I have 50 on Polygon and 50 on Ethereum, then the solver will pay for that transaction and then pay itself back using the funds on Polygon and Ethereum. And so this is like a relatively simple, and this is right now the most common way of moving funds across chains, especially in the chain abstraction vertical, because it's very fast and efficient and stuff like that. But our chain is actually responsible for coordinating these transactions with these solvers in a way that is atomic and safe and verifiable. And so we can actually verify and settle these transactions on chain, on the L1, before we give it to the solvers. And so it reduces risk. It makes the system more decentralized because you're not really relying on Particle to be like some centralized coordinator of everything. And it allows us to actually settle and verify the validity of transaction sequences before they get pushed to solvers. And so this is essentially why we have the L1 as a part of our architecture. We thought about other ways of doing it, but every other way to some degree leads to more centralization, which is somewhat of a common theme. We actually talked about this a little bit. Altan and I did a live stream with Fluent the other day, and we talked about on-chain versus off-chain. And so like chain abstraction a lot of the time does lead to sometimes a centralization problem or moving things off-chain. So we wanted to avoid that and reduce that as much as we could. And so the L1 was a mechanism for us to do that to some degree.
Yeah. But what do you think about if somebody did this in an L2, what were the differences? Right. I mean, L1s are actually great. Like, I mean, we've just been chatting with Michael because it's like at L1s you can control everything, but you also as a builder yourself, right? Like part of the network. Also, the gas fees don't get anywhere. Like the gas fees are used in here. Actually, maybe it's different for chain abstraction because you need to use the gas fee to do something on other chain. So you still have to sell on the token. But have you guys considered an L2 or like, if you were to build this on an L2, like what would be the differences for you guys?
I think you could probably build very similar functionality on an L2. We specifically chose like an L1 as kind of air quotes. We built a Cosmos app chain essentially. We built a chain using the Cosmos SDK, and it's EVM compatible. But that's essentially kind of the core of what we did. And we like the Cosmos SDK because you have a lot of flexibility there. You can make it EVM compatible. You also have access to IPC, so you can do some really interesting things with that. And you just have a ton of customization flexibility with the actual architecture of the chain, which for us is going to be really important, especially when it comes to some of these, I guess, more ambitious components that we're going to be implementing. And so we felt that was the best kind of path to go. A long time ago, we had the idea of actually launching an L2. It was going to be something that we considered for quite a while, and was kind of a part of our original architecture back probably 1 year plus ago. But we decided to move to a Cosmos app chain, and that's been working out for us pretty well so far. We're still a little bit away from mainnet. Probably Q4 is kind of our current date, but I think we're pretty happy with that decision. I think originally we were looking at like, ZK EVMs and how do we kind of make this most efficient? And, there's a pretty big overhead difference between launching an L2 and launching an L1. I mean, just like there's a lot more work involved typically with an L1, especially when it comes to bootstrapping validator sets and all these different things. It's pretty complicated, and it's just more involved typically. But I think we've had a pretty good experience with it so far, and the benefits that you get from using Cosmos SDK have outweighed, I think, the drawbacks of the additional overhead. And so I think, you could probably like functionally you could build pretty similar architecture on an L2, I think. there'd probably be some differences in terms of, security assurances and stuff like that. But I think overall, we chose the L1 route because the Cosmos ecosystem and the Cosmos SDK is pretty strong.
Ethan, could you maybe talk a little bit about the future-proof architecture of particle network? I found that phrase actually interesting. I think it's on the website, but it's like chain abstraction has come around and everyone's saying like, oh, wow, all these things with gas fees and addresses and account names and everything, we can innovate upon it immensely and change the game for users. I don't think many people have thought, where does this go in the future if you run it forward 3 years, say? And I know that there was things listed in that architecture around like messaging, bundling, things like that. So maybe you can just paint a picture of like what is a future-proof architecture on Particle Network.
Yeah, I think for us, a very big important component of how we build things is that it's very open to structural changes and to plugging in different architectural providers and stuff like that without really many changes to the protocol itself. And so we actually use, for example, like one of the original things that we proposed was something called, for the chain itself, aggregated data availability. So when we originally proposed this, it was a little bit more of a controversial concept. I think it's more normalized now. Like you have Manta that does multi-DA and stuff like that. But aggregated DA was essentially like looking at this saying, well, we don't really feel comfortable, especially when it comes to kind of like future-proofing and reducing points of failure. We don't really feel comfortable using a single DA layer and being completely reliant on that for like the extent of our lifetime as a provider and as within the chain itself. And so we built, or we kind of proposed aggregated DA, which is like the ability to plug in any DA provider and actually load balance between requests and where you post data. And so that was one thing. And even like with our validator set, we use a mixture of our own validators as well as we've been doing a lot of work with the Babylon team and allowing that validator set to contribute to consensus to where we don't have to have a complete validator set that is totally economically secure that validates the chain. And so like from an architectural perspective on the chain, we have a few things that have really been designed around reducing points of failure and being able to plug in pretty much any other provider and have it just work. From a more user perspective and within the smart accounts themselves, we believe like ERC 437 to be a relatively long-term standard, although universal accounts can theoretically work with pretty much any account abstraction standard, as long as it has like the really fundamental components of account abstraction. And so if we move to like a protocol level AA, then universal accounts can adapt to that really easily, and it really won't disrupt things too much. And so we've kind of designed our architecture around adaptability, as inevitably the landscape will change and better UX technologies will kind of be released. But I think ideally universal accounts will always be there as an option, and hopefully as a somewhat of a base layer implementation where especially that applications and users and wallets potentially that want that functionality, that want that balance consolidation, which I believe will be most applications and most users, especially as we get into more consumer onboarding. I think universal accounts are going to be one of the main ways to do that. Although, of course, and that's not to say the universal accounts are the only implementation that are going to be popular over long term. I think that there are many other fantastic projects that are building also at what I consider the account level. And they're doing a great job with this as well. And so I think that probably what you're going to see is a number of account level solutions over the next few years that are adopted by users and applications and wallets. And ideally, they're all pretty interoperable. So if I go to an application that's using universal accounts, or if I go to an application that's using, I don't know, Orb Labs or some other, account level solution, as a user, it feels pretty similar to me. And if I want to switch wallets, it feels pretty similar to me as well. And so I think this is the ideal future, and this is kind of how we're building towards that. What we're going to be doing eventually, that's also I was actually talking about this in the, there's a channel on Telegram, Chain Abstracted Nerds, it's ran by the Socket team. And I was talking about the importance of having unopinionated neutral infrastructure for long-term sustainability. And so what I mean by this is that basically having, in this case, an account level chain abstraction solution that is not clashing necessarily with other solutions in the same space. And so, because as a user, the users don't care if they're using Particle Network, or if they're using, project A and B and C. They just want to, they just want to use an application. They just want to access their balances and have that be it. Again, same thing with like the chain that you use. the provider and the account level solution that you use should ultimately be up to either the wallet or the application that's being used. And so that shouldn't affect an end user experience. And this is really important because one of the main like issues for me personally, as well as just like the larger chain abstraction space, has been, well, we're solving for fragmentation, but what if we're introducing more fragmentation right now by just having a bunch of solutions that totally clash with each other and are not interoperable? And so I think what's really important, what we're also striving for, is having this unopinionated infrastructure where, as a user, I can go to an application that's using Particle, I can go to an application that's using pretty much any other account level project, and the experience is the same for me. The only difference is basically that those fundamental technical differences and different capabilities that is more developer facing. So it's a very similar philosophy to the whole like why chain abstraction exists in the first place, and that's kind of how we're building and positioning universal accounts, is to be neutral infrastructure that fits quite well with the rest of the ecosystem. And so as things start to scale and as more users come into the space, we can kind of be prepared for that, and it won't become a conflict of interest where like we're trying to get everybody on like our standard, but like there's a bunch of other standards and like different ways of looking at it. And so that's at least a little bit more about how we're looking at the future.
Okay. What are the things when you look at the landscape today? I know we talked about the, and the end of team did a mapping. How do you see all of that talk to each other? So what are the things that the community should do to be able to not fragment further, but kind of unite everything, right? Because when I look at that, I'm like, I see the same thing as like the L1, L2 landscape. There's a lot of stuff. What should be the mental model for that?
Yeah, so I think the way that we kind of have defined it, there's kind of like two ways to look at the chain abstraction stack. First of all, the cake framework is of course the most popular one. Although sometimes recently I've been more hesitant to use it because what I've noticed is that it's actually been creating some confusion with people where they see it as too generalized, or it's a little bit unclear what the purpose of chain abstraction is. And so I think it was somebody from Anoma on Twitter yesterday, and they're like, I still don't know what chain abstraction is. And somebody commented, I think it was Kalani Network, and they tried to give him a definition. And he was like, I feel like chain abstraction is just some rehashing of interoperability and account abstraction and intents. And I replied, I think you're kind of conflating the cake framework with what really is a simple goal of chain abstraction. And so the way that I've found to be most useful of looking at the chain abstraction stack is basically in 3 different layers that make it a little bit easier to really understand how everything's going to fit together. And so these 3 layers are essentially categorizations of chain abstraction solutions themselves. So at kind of the top of the funnel, you have the application layer. And so this is going to be things like Socket or a cluster, Agoric, basically things that are more developer facing, solutions that integrate at the application layer. So actually give developers the ability to programmatically compose and exist across multiple chains simultaneously. There's a lot of solutions that are building towards this. It's basically giving developers the ability to create chain-agnostic applications, right? Which I think Nir has also been talking a lot about this idea of chain-agnostic applications recently as well, which I'm a big fan of this concept because I think giving developers the ability to create really unique experiences that can basically span across any blockchain and not really needing to, as a developer, deploy on different chains or like it's right now working across chains as a developer is pretty complicated. And so these solutions basically will reduce that complexity and allow for experiences that can exist across any chain in the ecosystem depending on what the needs are. And there's no complexity associated with that. And so yeah, Socket, Agoric, even chain signatures to some degree, and many other solutions are building out this layer. And then you have underneath that, you have the account layer. So this is basically giving users a single balance that you can use everywhere. And so this is things like Particle Network, Orb Labs, Arcana, One Balance to some degree. Also chain signatures have some overlap in this layer. And so this is essentially like the more user-facing part of the stack, the account layer. It's what users will interface with directly to have this property of balance consolidation everywhere. Underneath that, you have a somewhat more debated upon layer, which is something that you can call the blockchain layer. And so this is the third and final one, which is things like Polygon Ag layer or Optimism Superchain, ZK Sync Elastic Chain. Like basically roll-up clusters, I think is a way that the roll-up defined it, or chain collectives or whatever you want to call it. Groups of chains that basically share share some properties underneath kind of some larger infrastructural umbrella, like the ag layer, for example. And so if you have these three layers of basically how you approach chain abstraction, the way that I see it is that you have a lot of collaboration vertically. So vertically, there's no as a user, I actually don't know the difference if I'm using particle and cluster or particle and agoric or particle and socket, because that's a very background thing. And same thing ideally if I'm using socket and particle and orb labs or whatever it may be, like the experience is very similar across these. So vertically in this stack of those three layers, there's a lot of collaboration. And so you can work very closely with these teams across the stack. And I don't really think there's ever going to be fragmentation there, because they're each part of the stack is solving a different part of the problem, and there's very little overlap between these parts of the problem. They exist in isolation, and so each of these providers are solving those problems distinctly. And I don't really think there's going to be fragmentation vertically. I think that there will be competition and potentially fragmentation horizontally. So what I mean by this is that specifically between, I think especially account layer solutions and blockchain layer solutions. Between application layer solutions, I don't know. I think that's also, because it's so application specific, I'm not too worried about that. But I think, as I mentioned a moment ago, the most fragmentation that you're going to see and the most competition is going to be between account layer solutions and between blockchain layer solutions. I think that the biggest risk is going to be between account level solutions in terms of creating more fragmentation, because ultimately, like, even just now, like, if an application is using one SDK versus another and another, as long as it's just doing something for me in the background, I don't really care too much about it. But if I'm using one account standard versus another account standard and then 3 or 4 others, then this affects me as a user, because now I need to migrate funds, or like each of them are totally different wallets, stuff like that. And so I think the important thing will be that there is some degree of, I think the market will move us towards this direction, but I think most account layer solutions that are successful will have some degree of interoperability between them built in, or they're all just going to be neutral providers that are compatible with accounts across any application. And so there's no need to migrate or manage different account managers, things like that. I think the migration piece is really going to be the biggest point of fragmentation. The requirement for a user to move across different account layer solutions and move their funds across them, I think is going to be where most of this fragmentation comes from. And so solving this is going to take some time, but I think that the market will reward providers that take steps to be more interoperable with one another. And so ideally, I think what we're going to see is probably 3 to 4 winners at this layer that end up materializing and being popular across the stack, and developers and wallets and whatnot will choose whatever account layer solution is best based upon maybe whether or not it uses smart accounts, or signature properties. Do you only need to sign once? Do you need to sign for every transaction? What are the cross-chain mechanisms look like? Do you use solvers? Are you using a more traditional bridging mechanism? I mean, these are kind of fundamental architectural things that I think the market will optimize for. But I think that's kind of how I view the stack and competition between it. Most important kind of component of this is that within this kind of multi-layer, 3-layer stack, everything is very collaborative vertically and competitive horizontally, which I think is actually a good thing, and it's quite healthy for the space.
That would be a pretty cool diagram. Do you guys? I don't know if you guys have created that, but it might be the visual. I think would go a long way for outsiders to kind of be able to put the pieces of it together and kind of see where we're going. I like the way you phrase that in terms of there's a lot of competing visions for chain abstraction. Not all of them are going to win, but the more collaborative ones are the ones that are best positioned. I think what I always find myself thinking when you just kind of went through that whole stack is just like, what maybe, and this is more for, I guess, the audience, what is it that everyone sees at the end of the tunnel that's incentivizing all of these people to launch all of these products and companies to try to solve chain abstraction? Like, what is the best case scenario of where this goes for crypto in your understanding?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of moving parts to that. I think that first of all, you kind of mentioned something that I want to touch on just briefly, which is why are all these providers, like, what are the incentives really for all these providers to launch all these solutions? And so I think this is sort of an interesting conversation, because what's probably going to end up happening is that a lot of these chain abstraction providers at these different parts of the stack are just basically additional toll booths that a user goes through. And so this is in terms of how this impacts user experience. I mean, of course, adding more and more, like taking my cut from like providing my services, it definitely impacts things a little bit. I think that's how you're going to see a lot of the value creation within these projects go, is that there's going to be some slight fee on the transactions done by an application level solution. And, maybe account level solutions will take small fees on transactions, or so there's some way of extracting value throughout that process, right? Which I think is, there's a debate to be had there of like, how many toll booths can we really have infrastructurally until it's just like we're bombarding users with just taking value at every single, like just extracting as much value from users as we can. So that's one point that's interesting that you brought up. In terms of like the end result for end users, I think that there's kind of two components to this that are going to be really important. The first is just from a purely user experience perspective. Like the end goal is that as a user, I should be able to go to any application and use it and not know the chain that I'm using. By default, I shouldn't be required to know the chains that I'm interacting with. I should just use the application, and then that's it. As a user, I should have no concept of the underlying blockchains of these applications. Now, this property is highly debated on Twitter. Should we really hide this information from users, and how practical is this and stuff like that?
That's why I was smiling. I was like, yeah, I agree with you, but it's just like, how do we do, let's say, Michael launches a chain and it's a rug chain. How do we know that it's not a rug chain? And by the way, there's an app that rugs everyone, right? So that's an actually interesting point. Like it's abstract, but have you seen anything there that like could be done on the wallet level, or is there something that you would say like, oh, it would be actually awesome if somebody built this on Parlay Network when we go live?
Yeah, I think like in terms of reducing this risk specifically, I think a lot of it is going to just come down to trusting applications. And so applications that are trustworthy are going to ultimately win in the market under these conditions. And I think that I'm sure there will be some applications that you interact with that are interacting with some rug chain, or they have some malicious thing going on in the background, and just gonna have to kind of weed those out or have some mechanism of identifying that. I think there was one idea from, I believe it was Socket, that I thought was quite interesting, where it's like wallets or applications or something, probably wallets, they have like risk scores for the transactions that you're executing. So like if you have a sequence of transactions, it'll like look at those transactions to see what chains are being interacted with. And then before you confirm, it'll say, here's like the risk assessment of this transaction. It's really high right now because you're interacting with a chain that has, 5 all-time transactions on it. And so you want to be wary of that. But even that, like, I think that's a great idea in terms of like reducing the risk. But I think any information that you give users about this is going to make it difficult for them, because at the end of the day, a lot of users, especially the users that we're targeting here, they have no idea what any of this means. Ideally, like they don't even risk scores, I think might be a little bit too much for them. I mean, these are general Web2 users here, and what works best for them is the absolute simplest, least cognitively demanding path possible. And to achieve that, there has to be some degree of trust between a user and ultimately the application that they're using. Otherwise, we have to give them some information and hope that they will act upon that information. And I think that's like, I think in the space today, a lot of people overestimate the ability for most people to do this for themselves and to make decisions based on their own security and based on information that's presented to them when it comes to things like transactions. It's a lot that we're asking for people. And so I think if you look at it from the perspective that, there's going to be an ecosystem of applications that are most popular, and that's like most people are going to use applications that are established in the market and make responsible decisions about the chains that they're interacting with. And I think that's going to reduce the risk. But there definitely will be some security considerations in terms of, how are we handling that for newer users. I think the important component of this property of like hiding the end chain from the user, making to where they aren't aware of this, I think is the caveat that this isn't forced. And so this is really important, because as a user, and this is like a big concern that a lot of people have on Twitter, is that, well, hold on, like chains have vibes, and I care about the vibes that these chains have. And I really, I'm quoting somebody that famously said this on Twitter, and it's talked about a lot, which is that like, I want to be aware of the chains that I have because I care about the properties of these chains, all these different things. And so like, I understand that, but I think that that's fine. Like if crypto native people want to have the access to that information, they want to act upon the information of the chains that they're using and where they hold funds, and absolutely, like, I mean, chain abstraction shouldn't take that away from people. Like the abstraction and the removal of this information of the chains that you're using should not be forced. It should be an option. It should be by the default. But if I want to access that information, I can. I think that the idea that most people will want to see the chains that they're using, in my opinion, I think is not going to be the case. Same way, like, if we all of a sudden force everybody to know what cloud provider every website that they use is built on, it's like nobody doesn't know what to do with that information or how to are we all of a sudden going to start doing research into what cloud provider has the most secure server handling and the most distribution? Are they using bare metal, or are they, whatever, like nobody's going to do this research and nobody cares about this. So I think that this is going to be a similar thing with crypto and with like blockchain specifically. They're going to turn into sort of like a cloud provider where most people are not going to care about it. If it's really important to you and your feeling of control, then absolutely they should have access to that information. So I think that's, like, from a user experience perspective, the optimal outcome is going to be something where they don't need to know what chain that they're using. They can just use applications. I think from a market perspective, which is actually more interesting to me than the UX piece, I think from a market perspective, we're going to see a pretty massive shift in how applications are built, right? And so I wrote a short Twitter article about this a little while back, but there's this argument that's made a lot of the time, which is we don't need more infrastructure. We need apps. Where are the apps? Like, we just need more apps. We need people to build apps. And it's like, I agree, like, definitely. But right now within the market, the incentives are really not there to create truly innovative applications. Most people stick to creating easy applications that still capture value. So forking existing applications or building, sometimes half-baked things for specific ecosystems because people use that out of convenience. Because most users today, in a lot of cases, are captured out of convenience because they're siloed. So, if I have liquidity on, I don't know, cookie chain, like some random niche chain, and, there's 10,000 users on this chain, and I launch a DEX for this chain, that's the only DEX on this chain, then of course I've just captured the value of everybody on this chain, because otherwise they have to bridge and do all these things, and by default they're siloed into this ecosystem. And so if I can just simply fork Uniswap and add a different logo to it and then deploy it here, then I capture a lot of value. So really the incentives today are not aligned with developers building innovative applications. And a lot of this is due to the fact that users are siloed. And so all of a sudden what we're going to see, hopefully, is that with chain abstraction, we're going to have this sudden shift where users are no longer siloed and users are agnostic to the specific chain that they're using. And so there's no more, I'm using this out of convenience. Everything to end users is a choice based on application quality, not convenience. So I think this small change is going to have pretty massive impacts to the overall ecosystem. It's the idea that as an application, as a developer, I can no longer just build something that is lazy or that is half-baked because I'll still get users because I'm deploying it in a few different ecosystems. I am forced now to create high-quality applications with product market fit that genuinely attract users. Otherwise, I'll fail as an organization, and I won't actually generate any revenue. And so the competition in the market now will reward innovative applications because users are much more opinionated based upon quality and not based upon the convenience of wherever they have their funds located, right? So I think this change in users' opinion, what they optimize for within their experience, and ultimately looking for quality over convenience, I think this will move the industry in a way where this whole we just need more apps is no longer going to be really a thing that people say, because people will build apps because that's where the money is at. That's how you generate revenue at this point. That isn't really the case today in a lot of scenarios. And so I think that with chain abstraction, hopefully we're going to see that shift, and that will be the most impactful thing, because we're going to see the agnostification of users from chains, which will impact the market, make things more competitive, allow applications to really create more truly innovative things and capture user value from that. And from a user experience perspective, things are much more simplified. They're much more accessible for Web 2 users. And in total, you have this, hopefully, a very new type of experience where we have great applications, PMF applications, as well as users that have a lot of flexibility there. And so maybe I'm a little bit over optimistic about everything, but I think it's an interesting way of looking at it.
So kind of to summarize, you're saying there's not going to be any more copy pasta.
Hopefully. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's always going to be copy pasta, right? But it's just that, like, if you even think about it, the person that does it, like Pump.fun, for example, I mean, it is a user app. I mean, we can discuss the utility of it, but it is the first kind of app that it does, and people try to fork it, and nobody was able to value capture as much as they did. Like Uniswap is the same, right? Like it's the first AMM built on Ethereum, and then people forked it, and then the value that the other ones that took is not the same. The problem with this is like, maybe I'll ask this question on the developer side is, if you come into this space, you see these massive rounds, right? Like, so you saw like with the last, I don't know, quarter 2, 3, you're like, oh, like Barra Chain raised 100 million, like Store put 140, like, and then you look at maybe it's just one example of Polymarket, but the rest is kind of like very hard to find applications that raise a lot of money. And you as a builder, I was like, I'm going to build one too, because it's just seems like I'm more likely to value capture. And when you go to VCs and other people, they also tend to take a infrastructure bet rather than a app bet, right? So like even in Chain-Agnostic, they are more likely to power or invest into a company that does chain abstraction than the app. So like, what should happen there for this to kind of switch? Because like I've tried to build you can actually build a very fee generating business in crypto just doing apps, because like it's just a numbers game. You build, and there's something that's gonna like stick with the users. Even though you have like 5,000 users, you can actually generate more than a Web2 app, because you have this like fee structure that you can put in. But like in your case, like how do we switch this developer mentality from this like let's build infrastructure to let's build apps?
I think a lot of it's going to come from a cultural change in terms of investing strategy. And I think that there has to be some cutoff for investing in more infra. There's a point in which it's super redundant, and eventually there's not much more value to capture there. Like, I don't know, like, I mean, you can only launch tokens and whatever, build more infrastructure for so long. Like, there's a limitation to it at some point. And so I think that especially once these incentives start to shift, and the viability and really the push from end users to create applications that are optimized for quality, I think as that changes, hopefully what I would expect is that the VC sentiment and the investing strategy will shift a little bit slowly towards applications, especially if there's a lot more than just Polymarket that end up actually generating real value. Because if we start to see the shift of clearly infrastructure is losing its momentum in terms of like we're kind of hitting our limit there, but all of a sudden now, okay, well, we're seeing that applications are starting to proliferate a little bit more, and maybe there's like 2 or 3 examples now of like good large applications that are generating a lot of value rather than just 1 or 2. I think that that should hopefully cause a change in sentiment. And of course, if VCs and investors, if they move towards applications, then that's where developers will go naturally. But also some of this comes down to like, a big band-aid for this right now has been the app chain thesis of like, okay, well, we can build applications, but they're also chains. And so then you get to like, sort of loophole it, and like you're also launching a chain at the same time, but you're building an application. And so like, you still get to capture some value in that sense. And so I think that's been the strategy for many, but that's probably a reason why so many are launching app chains right now, is just purely because of the optics. But I think that, of course, there's no guarantee that sentiment will shift, but I do think that we're going to start like, overall investors are going to start realizing, especially as we start hitting the cap with things like chain abstraction and other like fundamental technologies. I don't know how much more you can go. I think infrastructure will always be a vertical that is invested in. I mean, there's always room to improve, of course, but ideally applications in terms of value capture and in terms of opportunity will outweigh that of infrastructure. I think it already does, but I think importantly, people will start to realize this as more applications start to proliferate, especially with the implementation of chain abstraction.
I think it makes sense too, in a sense of like, if you went back 2 years and you said, build me a ticketing dApp that we can implement at concerts, and you think about all the friction involved in your chain, your gas fee, getting money into the ticketing dApp, like moving the potential NFT to another chain. And if you say, okay, 3 years later, we've solved all those problems, so now your ticketing dApp 2.0 can run on one wallet across chains. It can be connected to an on or off ramp, and it's able to go. I think that makes sense, at least to me, of just how this space builds out. Because then the incentive says, okay, who can build the most creative ticketing dApp now that we've solved for all of the kind of unsexy pain in the ass points to even use it in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Who can create the best ticketing application that gets adopted the most because it has the best user experience and, the best underlying features.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, that's what is going to win ultimately. It's about quality. Right. And so I think, that factor will hopefully, and it just like I think almost like a free marketization of Web3, where like Web3 moves far into more like a traditional market, where quality is optimized rather than kind of like, it's a little bit convoluted right now how it all functions, where it's not really like a traditional market in that sense, where like everything is highly competitive and quality optimized. But I agree. I think we're going to start seeing that pretty soon.
Do you want to wrap up, Altan?
Yeah, I think it's actually 1 minute away. Yeah, it's nice to chat with you, Ethan. What is the if somebody comes in and watches this podcast, what is the one thing that you would want to tell folks? It could be about yourself, it could be about Parligan Network, anything that comes to mind.
Well, chain abstraction is inevitable. Follow me on Twitter at TABASCO Web3. I post a lot about chain abstraction, and we also do post on our main Twitter at Particle and DWRK. We're going to be launching mainnet and universal accounts in the next quarter or two, and the space is speeding up really quickly. Keep an eye on chain abstraction, and I really appreciate you guys having me on. I think those are some great questions and kind of got into the weeds there. So I'm looking forward to the episode, and of course, just keep up with chain abstraction.
Awesome. We'll stay on the lookout for you, Ethan. You're a rising star in Web3, so we appreciate the time, and good luck with everything.
Likewise. Appreciate it, guys.